NASA's Golden Era. Historic photos from the glory days of space exploration. The early days of space exploration saw groundbreaking achievements, including moon landings and spacewalks. Iconic NASA images capture this historic era. NASA was founded during the Cold War in response to the Soviet Union's 1957 launch of Sputnik, prompting the US to establish a dedicated space agency to assert its leadership. In 1958, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA to compete with the Soviet Union in the space race. Over the next decade, NASA launched ambitious programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, to advance space exploration. The Mercury program achieved human spaceflight, followed by Gemini, which refined space maneuvers and technology for lunar missions. These efforts led to the Apollo program, culminating in the historic moon landing on July 20th, 1969, by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. NASA continued advancing human spaceflight in the years that followed. NASA astronaut Walter Schirra, one of the men who participated in Project Mercury. The project focused on getting a man into orbit. 1959. NASA scientists test a model of the Mercury capsule in a spin tunnel in 1959. 3 months before NASA launched the first American astronaut into space in 1961, they sent a chimpanzee named Ham on a pioneering mission. Fortunately, his mission was successful. Trained to pull levers in response to sounds and lights, Ham performed his tasks admirably in space, moving only slightly slower than he had on Earth. In 1959, Nancy Roman joined NASA. Just a year later, she was already serving as the chief of the astronomy and relativity programs in the Office of Space Science. The Mercury 7. This was NASA's first group of space travelers, here gathered for a photo during their survival training exercises in Nevada. 1960. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to complete a full orbit around the Earth during Project Mercury. John Glenn, during Mercury pre-launch activities, January 23, 1962. Glenn enters the Mercury Friendship 7 spacecraft during pre-launch preparations, February 20th, 1962. In 1962, a Gemini capsule is tested in the Unitary Plan wind tunnel at NASA's Ames Research Center in California. Unlike the Mercury capsules, which carried one astronaut, Gemini capsules held 2 astronauts and were designed to test critical capabilities like spacewalks and extravehicular activity for future missions. Gene Kranz in the Mission Control Room at Johnson Space Center in Houston, 1965. As a flight director, Kranz was instrumental in guiding the missions that successfully landed humans on the Moon. Ed White and James McDivitt pilot the Gemini 4 mission in 1965. This mission saw the first U.S. spacewalk, which was performed by White. Ed White, out for his famous spacewalk. June 1965. Patricia McDivitt and Patricia White call their husbands, astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White, during the Gemini 4 mission. Astronauts Thomas P. Stafford and Eugene A. Cernan sit in their Gemini spacecraft with the hatches open while awaiting the arrival of the recovery ship USS Wasp. June 6, 1966. The Apollo 1 crew prepares for water egress training at the Gulf of America. Left to right, astronauts Edward H. White II, Virgil Thurtz Grissom, and Roger B. Chaffee. October 27, 1966. The crew of Apollo 1, just weeks before, they were tragically killed when a fire erupted in their capsule during testing. It was one of NASA's most horrific accidents. 1967. Walter Schirra commands the Apollo 7 mission in 1968. the first crewed Apollo space mission, this trip saw the first live TV broadcast of Americans from space. William Anders captured the first Earthrise ever to be seen by humans during the Apollo 8 mission. December 1968. The Apollo 11 crew, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, smile for the cameras in 1969, just a couple months before they would take their historic trip to the moon. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy delivered a landmark address to Congress, outlining an ambitious vision for America's space program. He declared, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." The following year, in 1962, NASA established the Launch Operations Center to prepare for the complex lunar missions ahead. Following Kennedy's tragic assassination in 1963, the facility was renamed the John F. Kennedy Space Center in his honor. Former President Lyndon B. Johnson and Vice President Spiro Agnew joined the crowds to watch the Apollo 11 launch in 1969. Notably, President Richard Nixon had a somber speech prepared in case the astronauts did not survive their mission. Buzz Aldrin gears up as Apollo 11 approaches the moon. As was the case with many Apollo 11 photos, Neil Armstrong was the man behind the camera. One of the first boot prints on the moon, made by Buzz Aldrin during the Apollo 11 mission. July 20th, 1969. Buzz Aldrin walks on the surface of the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. After landing on the moon, the crew of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, returned home to Earth on July 24th, 1969. Upon splashing down, the astronauts underwent a 21-day quarantine. The purpose of this was to protect against the possibility of lunar contagion. Mission Control celebrates with cigars and American flags after the first successful moon landing in 1969. Disaster nearly struck NASA during Apollo 13's failed mission in 1970. In this photo, the Mission Control team celebrates the safe return of the flight crew to Earth. Before Apollo 13 became NASA's most famous, successful failure, the astronauts on board were merely struggling to survive. Due to a disastrous oxygen tank explosion, they were forced to abandon their mission of visiting the moon and instead focus on returning safely to Earth. Edgar Mitchell photographs Alan Shepard holding the American flag on the moon's surface during the Apollo 14 mission. February 1971. Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison H. Schmitt plants a flag on the moon in December 1972. This remains the most recent time that humans have set foot on the moon. This was the little facts of the golden era of NASA. Hope to see you next time.